We've had a little bit of foreshadowing about some of the content of our panel through some of the previous panels in the day. I think one of the big lessons of COVID that is really easy for everyone to recognize straight away is that it shows the nearly limitless power of the regulatory state specifically under conditions of emergency. So in the United States, for example, we've seen a great variance between the application of emergency powers across different states, depending on the nature of the individual governor. But one thing that we really haven't seen, unfortunately, is a lot of curtailment of these emergency powers, no re-examining of these. And I hope that we do. And part of the reason is because, not just in the United States, but worldwide, part of the reason that I think that we need to take a look at what emergency powers are and how they're exercised is because the left is already reorienting the same toolkit to other issues in society. So despite what we pray is a transitory need to focus on COVID-19, in the future, the left has a whole wide variety of emergencies that they consider to be equally important to the pandemic. And chief among these, for example, is the climate crisis that they talk a lot about. And indeed, environmental concerns are something that everyone shares, I think. But the weaponizing of some of these legitimate concerns towards aims that grow the power of the state and focus the power of state on regulation of all different parts of our lives also has the potential to paradoxically frustrate our attempts at addressing environmental concerns, because as we've seen up to now looking at the variance between what wealthier nations have been able to do on the environment versus second world and third world countries, what they've ever been able to do, we see that innovation really is the key to moving toward good environmental stewardship. And so one of the things I hope to look at on this panel is if it's possible and how it is possible to solve this paradox of innovation being the key to good environmental stewardship, and at the same time having the challenge that regulations themselves frustrate the creation of innovation in the economy. The government fundamentally really has three ways to take money out of the economy, or that it does take money out of the productive economy. Taxes are the most obvious one. Deficit spending we heard about earlier today, especially as a tax on the poor, and in fact, deficit spending as it creates inflation operates in exactly that way. But finally, regulatory burdens function often as a tax, and in some cases it's sort of hard to tell the difference. For example, in the case of carbon taxes, we see that this is really a regulatory mechanism that functions somewhat like a tax, even though it's border adjustable. In the United States, we're currently trying to fight a tax and spending package into which has been crammed rebadged environmental regulations along the terms of the Green New Deal. And we have a new drug pricing regulation in the US that is a part of the same package that is itself enforced with a 95% tax. And so to some degree, it's important to recognize that these three ways that the government takes money out of the economy are fungible. So when we're looking at how to maximize or how to create an environment of economic freedom, we have to make sure that we keep all three of these pieces of the puzzle in mind, because pushing on one is just likely to push this government action into one of the others, and our attempt to create freedom may be frustrated. So with that, I guess I'll start with that question, and please feel free to depart, but how do we resolve that paradox of environmental stewardship when these things can, by specifying specific government preferred alternatives, we frustrate the ability to innovate? Are we doing that somewhere successfully, and if so, how? And we'll start with Maria. I think it was on.
right now? Okay. Okay, thank you for having me here. Promyka Institute is the new conservative think tank settled in Warsaw, Poland, and we all very happy to be here and to catch up with you, and we hope we can cooperate in the future, and I hope that I will be able to invite you to some events in Poland. Anyways, as it is written in a handbook and as it was said, I work in environmental protection and reusable energy sources area, so I would be happy to say a few things about this climate crisis and what is happening there. So first, we should remember that environmental protection is conservative at its core. We have many thinkers, such as Robert Scruton, who one of his thoughts was that decentralization should be at minimum level of countries, because only with decentralization of politics we can achieve the goal. And right now this goal is climate change. We have to do everything to fight with the climate crisis. And European Union is setting all these projects, all these policies, such as European Green Deal, such as Fit for 55. And some may say that this is the hardest goal to achieve in the history of economy of world. So it's gonna be very hard. And we should remember that this all centralization of politics may be very harmful for the entire matter, because it is discouraging societies and discouraging many people to do something. It also can stop the development of new technologies and innovation if we are told exactly what to do by the European Union. So we have this very important, very noble goal, which is protect the environment, future of our planet, future of our children, grandchildren, and so on. This is very important and very noble, and we have to care about it. But on the other hand, this goal is supposed to be achieved by degradation of European economy, by degradation of entire regions, by losing many jobs, by raising poverty. And we cannot let them do this, because governments, local organizations should have the right and should have freedom of choice to choose the way which is the best for every country or every region in their country to fight climate change. Because we should remember that every country, every region is different, have different needs and different possibilities. And it cannot be done with someone from the top telling us what to do. And so these excessive ambitions that European Union has never happened if there's gonna be such a huge centralization. There's never gonna be agreement, because there will always be a group of countries who will block the projects, who will delay the debate, and it's going to be very hard to have some agreement. So we should remember that the most important thing is to do not let European Commission to provide all these Fit for 55 documents, because we just simply cannot do this right now. We should think about regions, about countries and their needs. This is the most important thing.
Okay, thank you. Otto, is it sufficient to look at nation-specific solutions?
I don't think so. Not when we're talking about climate change. But I would perhaps like to congratulate you on a very apt observation that regulation is really it could be compared to taxation. We all know that taxation comes with a huge cost to society, and we have in many countries, my country for instance, we have reformed the tax system. But there are strong indications that the cost of the regulatory state is it's more elusive, but it's very high, and it's probably growing. We have done a study of the regulatory state in Denmark, so this is what I know best. We tried simply to count the number of words in our legislation, in all the regulations, and what we found is that the number has tripled over the last 30 years. So tripled. We had 3 times as many words in regulations and in legislation as we had 30 years ago. If you look at the research into this, and we try to translate, these are American studies, but if you translate them into Danish conditions, this should come with a cost of around 25% of GDP. So that's the cost of this, just the expansion of the regulatory state over that period of time. How much is caused by the EU, you might ask? We try to study that as well, and I was actually a little bit surprised by the answer. The answer is that if we look at new legislation in Denmark over the same period, 18% has been initiated by the EU. So it's a lot. It's not as much as I expected, actually, but it's quite a lot. I think, however, it's important to realize that some of the new regulations coming from the EU has not necessarily meant an increasing burden. There has been projects in the EU which, even if it has entailed new legislation, it has actually reduced the regulatory state. And I'm thinking especially of the internal market in the EU, the free movement of people, capital, and goods. And that has been, even if it has meant some regulations, it has been a benefit. And really has been a benefit because it has regulated not the citizens of the EU as much as it regulated the governments. And there, I think the EU could have an appropriate role to play. However, if I look at what is happening lately, I'm quite concerned. Concerned that what we are seeing is a regrowth of the regulatory state. I think I'm quite concerned about the EU Commission, which seems to be really practicing what I would call a kind of populism from above. I think they are really grabbing for popular agendas to follow, and they're not really focusing on substance as much as keeping the union together by finding popular agendas. And I think we are seeing that in climate policy, for instance. So this is the popular agenda, at least to the north, and they want to get into that. Actually, the EU has a good system for regulating climate change in the cap and trade system, and it's a market-oriented system that sort of puts the externality of climate change into the price system, and then let the market deal with how to fix climate change. And the EU has recently put forward, I think you mentioned it, a proposal to reform the cap and trade system, which is I applaud. But at the same time, it has put forward a host of direct command and control proposals, which really steals the effect of the cap and trade system. Cap and trade really doesn't work unless it stands alone. And what they're doing is trying to regulate directly. And I think this is a concern, and I think we should perhaps today not only criticize the EU, the Commission, but also put forward a positive agenda. I think this is probably what Margaret Thatcher had in mind when he called this organization New Directions. And I think that invigorating the internal market, the subsidiary principle, and really focusing on where the EU can limit member governments in order to make the citizens of the EU freer. I think this could be our agenda and our answer to this development.
Thanks. Thanks, Robert. One of the points that I'd hoped you'd get to is how no government would have anticipated the rise of the sharing economy as one of its means to combat climate change or other issues of environmental stewardship. But the more efficient reallocation of resources is certainly having some sort of impact there. And you have, for the first time, a whole number of people who are able to exist without having their own personal car, for example. And no doubt this has a positive impact on climate change. Robert?
Yes, I will get to that. But before, I would like to thanks for having me here. It's really an honor for me. And maybe I prepare some introductory remarks, but maybe these remarks will answer or at least offer one of the solutions to the paradox of regulation and innovation. First of all, I would say that we have to reframe our discussion, because the framing of discussions usually influence what will be outcome of discussions. When people usually want to deregulate or are proponents of deregulation, they are speaking about how regulation are harming our economy, how they are not good for some kind of consumers, how they are hampering innovations. And to be honest, these are good arguments, and I agree with them. But I think that we should put so much focus and attention also on another part of the arguments, and these kind of arguments are about alternatives. What are the alternatives? What will replace this regulation when we want to get rid of them? And I think this is important because usually common people, when we talk about deregulation, they think that what will be there left is like void or anarchy or some kind of chaos. No, I know that all of you understand that when we get rid of the regulation, that there will be some private businessmen who will try to solve some kind of problems. Let's call them for example, asymmetrical informations, which are connected to sharing economy, for example. And usually common people don't understand this. You know, they just see that there is no regulation, that means there is a chaos. But fortunately, we are living in great times, and as you said, we are witnessing these kind of sharing economy platforms, and they don't only help us to use scarce resources more efficiently, but they also started to create their own regulations. They started to create their own ways how to protect consumers. And there is something really grateful, because now we can show that there is not just two choices, like regulation and no regulation, chaos, but there is also third choice, and there is the private regulations. And this is like alternative which we can show to people, and they can buy our arguments, because it's not so easy to understand what will replace regulation. And this creates another or many other advantages. For example, nowadays we have, or in my country, in Slovakia, we had competitions in providing of regulation. There is something which is people are not used to. You know, politicians and regulators are not used to have competition. They have monopoly on providing regulation. But in my country, we have kind of, I say, lazy and corrupted politicians. I know that all of you have also this kind of politician in your country, but believe me, in my country, these politicians are really bad, or really good at being corrupted. And when Uber came to my country, they don't care about this Uber. You know, for like 3 or 5 years, Uber operated in my country in a gray zone. You know, they kind of avoid regulation, and of course, taxi business try to make some protest. But in my country, taxi drivers don't have good reputation, so also people don't care about them. And Uber was operating in this gray zone, and it created kind of, as I said, competition in regulation that in my country people could see how privately regulated service can work, you know, and they saw that Uber is cheaper, it has better services, and they demonstrated their preferences, and they were choosing Uber platform. And finally, for example, I could go to Ministry of Transportation, and I could argue that look at these companies, they have better regulation. Try to adapt your old public regulation to this new kind of business. And they agreed, and after 5 years, we deregulate taxi business. So I think that this is like important point that we should reframe our discussion about regulation, not just about, and we should focus not just on public regulation and how bad they are, but also about, and we should focus also on private regulation and what they offer to people, what kind of competition they are creating, and it will like help to deregulate another services. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Victoria? Should come on. I mean, I think it arrives on.
Can you hear me? Yeah? No? Yes? Okay. Innovation and regulatory reform is very much in fashion in the UK at the moment. The Prime Minister recently commissioned a task force on innovation, growth and regulatory reform. There's currently a formal consultation underway about reforms to our regulatory framework, and innovation forms quite an important part of that. But I fear that there are a couple of things to your point here that perhaps don't set us off in the right direction here in these reforms. First of all, I think that the present government operates an industrial strategy. Innovation is an important part of that industrial strategy. Now, unfortunately, for me, I sort of thought that not having to have an industrial policy anymore was a pretty good reason for leaving the EU. Unfortunately, our present government seems pretty dedicated to that and to pursuing innovations in a rather managed, directed, centrally planned kind of way. And green policy and climate policy very much plays into that, as the government is desperately trying to steer us towards our net zero by 2050 commitment. And rather than allowing market forces and innovation through entrepreneurs in a free market to do that, they are very much directing investment and subsidy towards particular preferred technologies, which I fear is not going to get us anywhere very fast, in some ways quite literally. And the other aspect is that, for example, this consultation about the better regulation framework includes a particular line asking for views on a particular change to help with, quote, striking a balance between economic growth and public protection. And that, I think, really illustrates this prevailing assumption that is at the heart of certainly our government, and I suspect most governments, that economic growth and innovation and new technologies are somehow in opposition to environmental protection, public protection, and that if left unregulated, you would just get untrammeled destruction of environment and untrammeled destruction of human well-being and employment rights and health and safety and all of these things. Now, we here as supporters of free markets and small government would, of course, realize that the economic growth, public protection, economic protection are not in opposition at all. And so any framework that proceeds from this assumption and the political culture that comes with us is going to lead us in the wrong direction, both in terms of individual freedom, and I'm afraid to say in terms of the objectives that it's seeking, namely a thriving culture of innovation that will deliver, great outcomes for the environment, the climate, all of this. These things could and should very much go hand in hand with economic growth and human thriving, not just in Britain and in Europe and in developed countries, but also, really importantly, in developing countries who are being asked to forego industrialization and development in the interests of meeting climate targets, which to me seems to be rather a luxury campaign on the part of Western governments, and obviously the UK government's very much in the vanguard of that. I would also echo your comments earlier as well about the impact of the measures that we saw to counter the pandemic in the past year or so. I think there's a real danger here that there will be a ratchet effect and an entrenchment of certain expectations of what is acceptable for the state to regulate, an entrenchment of safety culture, and an entrenchment of a sort of learned helplessness where individuals look to government and businesses, in fact, look to government to guide them through all kinds of decisions about how to live their lives and conduct their business that really should most effectively be taken at that individual level or at the level of that business. And what level of regulation is now acceptable, and what are the threshold conditions that we consider are valid to trigger those kinds of interventions. Obviously in the UK, this situation is exacerbated by the role of our state religion, the National Health Service, and I very much fear that it seems likely that we will see many more taxes, bans, and regulations being justified as necessary to, quote, protect the NHS, which was the slogan of our government throughout the pandemic. So I think, while our government, and actually lots of governments, the EU, the Commission, has an innovation principle in its regulatory toolbox, because broadly speaking, the Commission had been persuaded by businesses that the precautionary principle was suppressing innovation and was holding back developments in Europe in sort of competition with other jurisdictions that had a less prescriptive regulatory approach. The EU talks a good game on this. The British government, as I say, is pursuing innovation and regulatory reform. But as long as those prevailing assumptions remain in place, I just don't think any technocratic solutions around better regulation frameworks or innovation principles, which I certainly support. We can always improve those processes and the procedural guardrails. But for as long as politicians are going to make political commitments to intervene, and for as long as populations and voters will accept them and in many cases demand them, I just don't see that these technocratic solutions are going to be sufficient guardrails to protect our freedoms and to allow innovation to thrive.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit more about the precautionary principle and how the outlook of the UK is likely to be different from the EU, if it is at all?
Sure, well, I'd love to. In fact, just yesterday I published a paper on that subject. You can find it on the IEA website. It's called A British Innovation Principle, Do We Need One, and How Might It Work? And the idea here is that, sadly, the UK is transplanting the precautionary principle from EU law into our national law in a piece of legislation going through Parliament at the moment, the Environment Bill. It will embed the precautionary principle as a binding commitment in any field of policy that affects the environment, which really is a very wide field indeed. And what I talk about in my paper is the problem that we have is that the EU does have certain legal protections for innovation, partly in recognition that its use of the precautionary principle as a tool to assess risk and allow regulators to take action where there was perceived to be a significant risk even if they didn't have evidence on which to base their action, if the risk if the potential consequences are bad enough, you shouldn't be held back by a need for evidence in order to take action. That principle has been widely applied, misapplied, misinterpreted. It doesn't help that it doesn't have a fixed legal definition really anywhere. And unfortunately, as I say, the UK is transplanting that into our law. There was a strong political imperative behind doing so. And my concern was that we were importing the precautionary principle, but we weren't following that up with the protections for innovation that the EU has, however weak and however poorly applied. And so what I was calling for was some acknowledgement that innovation and costs to innovation, opportunities foregone, should be included both at a strategic level in defining what a policy is when the precautionary principle is in play, but also at a, as I say, at a technocratic level when you're carrying out impact analyses and cost-benefit analysis. Innovation, costs to innovation should be included in there as best you can.
Thank you. I had one additional question for Otto as well, and maybe we can take it to the audience and see if anybody has anything that they want to be addressed specifically. But I wanted to ask you to expand a little bit about carbon taxes or cap and trade and being sold as an alternative to regulation, and that's the way we see them sold in the United States so much, especially on the right. You know, it's if you were to be able to wave a magic wand and accomplish the replacement of all of these regulations with something like that, on its face, it seems like that might be desirable. But I haven't seen an example of this replacement actually occurring. Are you aware of this happening? And if so, where, and is it stable?
No, I think you hit on a very important point, because I think the economics of this is very simple. You need to get, if you have an externality, you have something wrong with the price system. So you need to fix the price system one way or the other. As we all know, what really makes our corporation, make our modern hyper-complex society work is the price system. It's very important. So, and the price system allows everybody to cooperate in the sense that it makes our cooperation consistent. This is really what the price system does. We don't have the environment in the price system, so there is a case for pricing externalities. This is, I think, if you question economists around the globe, 99% of them will say the same thing. That this is basically best dealt with through the price system one way or the other. However, there is also a political economy question here, or public choice problem, because this is not really what is being introduced by politicians. They do use carbon taxes. We have carbon taxes in Denmark. But instead of a uniform carbon tax, we have very different taxes on different emissions, which is not efficient. We have in the EU, we have the cap and trade system, which is it's not by any means perfect, but it's the best tool we got. But at the same time, we have a lot of additional regulation. We have subsidies for strong interest groups and so on. So I think you point to an important problem. There's simply a limit to what a government can do, taking all these political considerations into consideration. So that's really where the main problem is, and I don't think I can point to, like, I think you can find examples of externality taxation working in practice, but if we're talking climate change, not in the sense that all economists would agree would be the right way to do it. Nowhere.
Okay, great. Thanks. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like folks to take a look at on the regulatory side up here?
Thank you very much for the discussion. Adam Bartha from Epicenter. Otto, you have mentioned that it's important that we build a positive agenda, right? But you have also said that the cap and trade system is not perfect. So what are the kind of environmentalist free market ideas that we can proactively fight for on a European level? And I will try to pose the question in a positive way as well to Victoria about the opportunities that Brexit provides. So if we want to deviate from some of the regulatory overreach of the European Union, what does Brexit enable the UK to pursue, specifically sticking to the environment? Thank you.
I think if you look at it right now, and environmental questions, the most important thing on the agenda right now is the cap and trade system. It's by no means perfect, but it could be much better. And actually what the Commission has just proposed is going to enlarge it, include more emissions, which would be it would be a benefit. It would be a benefit to basically include everything in the cap and trade system and have nothing else. And I think this should be the agenda. And your point exactly that if this is the right solution, the politicians should adopt it, and then we should strongly oppose any attempt to regulate directly, to use subsidies, to ban certain technologies, to prefer certain other technologies, and so on. So I think that this would be an important question on the agenda. I do think there is a case for the EU playing a role in climate policy. I think it's much better than the individual member states doing it on their own. So there is the benefit here for the EU to step in, but they need to do it correctly. Otherwise, they'll just add to the regulatory state.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Shall I answer Adam's
Oh, yes,
second
you were addressed specifically.
question?
Sorry about that.
So it's another item where the British government is currently embarking on a specific program of really identifying all of the EU laws that we have carried over into our domestic law, which we just did a sort of copy and paste job in a hurry in 2019. And Lord Frost has announced, Lord Frost is our cabinet minister with responsibility for dealing with the EU. He's announced a specific program to qualitatively look at all of those rules in a sort of line-by-line exercise, which I think is very welcome and offers a great opportunity to hopefully identify rules that are OTOs or disproportionate and get rid of them or perhaps amend them. Now, clearly, I think we can probably expect a lot of resistance from all of the usual suspects to any possible change or repeal of any regulation. But hopefully, at least Lord Frost and his department are asking the right questions here. Now, in terms of the environment, the EU environmental regulations form a rather significant part of that, and I'm pretty convinced there will be things that we could improve on in there. And, oftentimes regulations that are intended to help the environment are counterproductive because they crowd out innovations that might actually allow people to do things better, whether that's to do with electric vehicles or energy supplies, whether it's to do with international trade policy, actually. There's lots of things we could do better there. And I suppose the point is, in many ways, we don't know. We don't know what the innovative developments of the future are. And so our opportunity is to be more open to them and not extinguish them ex ante before they've been allowed to happen. And I would also make the point as well that perhaps one of the best predictors of having a clean and green environment is prosperity. And so anything that we can do as a country to improve economic growth and prosperity seems pretty likely to also help with our environmental goals.
Thank you. Any other questions? I just had one other thing I wanted to ask Maria, which is that what are the types of factors that people should be looking at in terms of nations, when looking at policies that are specific to nations and regions that may differ, that people really need to be focused on?
I think that when creating a policy, environmental policy, as Robert earlier said, it should be not only, about tax carbon and everything, but also about, simple person, like consumer. We should be able to persuade them to be on board with us in this fight with climate change. For example, in Poland, Polish government did a very simple thing that led to huge growth of solar energy. We just have a simple program. Everyone who has its own house could apply for donation to do solar panels just on the roof. And even during pandemic, when it was hard time for everyone, even during pandemic, there was plenty of applications. It's like I think it was about 300,000 applications to do this simple installation. And right now, when you're riding through Polish small towns, you actually see that every household has its own solar panels. So it was very simple solution, and now Polish government also thinks about other areas such as thermomodernization and other stuff. But the big policies are important, but we should also focus on people and make them understand the problem and make them cooperate with us, with the governments. And that's why I said earlier that this decentralization, the activity of local organization who can cooperate with people, who can tell them what the problem is, that's one of the most important issues here.
Thank you. I think maybe that's a good point to end on, which is a look at potential non-state solutions to some of these issues. We shouldn't leave those off the table at all. And with that, I think we'll wrap up for the day. And so I'd like to thank all of our panelists for all of their insightful comments. And please feel free to grab them after the panel if you have additional questions.